The judge called the veteran's medals fake, until the general walked in and stopped everything. What happens when an arrogant judge decides to humiliate an elderly man over traffic violations, not knowing that this quiet 84-year-old veteran is someone the entire military considers untouchable? Sometimes one phone call can turn a courthouse into a battlefield, and sometimes heroes wear faded uniforms instead of black robes. The gavel struck 3 times, each blow echoing through the cramped courtroom like gunfire. Judge Harold Albright surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a man who had never questioned his own authority. At 58 years old, he had spent 2 decades wielding power from behind his mahogany bench, and today promised to be no different from countless others. Case number 7492, the clerk announced in a monotone voice. The State versus Frederick William Hudson. An elderly man shuffled forward, his weathered hands gripping a worn wooden cane. Fred Hudson moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had endured decades of hard use. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite his advanced age of 84 years, his posture retained traces of military bearing. What immediately caught Judge Albright's attention, however, was not the man's dignified appearance, but the array of ribbons and medals adorning his faded green military jacket. Rows of colorful fabric strips covered the left side of his chest, crowned by a distinctive star-shaped medal hanging from a light blue ribbon. "Mr. Hudson," Albright began, his voice dripping with practiced authority, "you stand accused of exceeding the speed limit by 15 miles per hour and failing to come to a complete stop at a designated stop sign. How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Fred replied quietly, his voice carrying the rough texture of age and countless cigarettes from decades past. The judge leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I see you've chosen to wear your costume to court today, Mr. Hudson. Tell me, did you purchase those little trinkets at the local military surplus store?" A ripple of discomfort passed through the small courtroom. Sarah Jenkins, Fred's court-appointed attorney, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. At 29 years old, she had been practicing law for only 3 years, but she had never witnessed such blatant disrespect from a sitting judge. "Your Honor," Sarah began, rising to her feet, "my client is an honorably discharged veteran of the United States Army. Those are legitimate military decorations earned through—" "I didn't ask for your opinion, Counselor," Albright snapped, his eyes never leaving Fred. "I'm addressing the defendant directly, Mr. Hudson. Do you honestly expect this court to believe that you're some kind of war hero? A man your age driving recklessly through our peaceful community, wearing what appears to be every medal the military has ever produced?" Fred remained silent, his weathered hands folded calmly in front of him. His pale blue eyes, though dimmed by age, held a steadiness that spoke of experiences far beyond the confines of this small-town courtroom. The judge's voice grew louder, more aggressive. "Let me tell you something, old man. I've seen dozens of pretenders like you come through my courtroom, veterans who think their supposed service gives them the right to break the law with impunity. Well, not in my court." Sarah felt her anger rising. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. My client has entered a guilty plea for minor traffic violations. There's no need for this kind of personal attack." "Personal attack?" Albright laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the courtroom walls. "I'm simply pointing out the obvious. Look at him, Counselor. An 84-year-old man wearing enough medals to outfit a marching band. It's pathetic." Fred's expression never changed, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but a profound sadness. He had faced enemy fire, watched friends die in foreign jungles, and carried wounded comrades to safety under intense combat conditions. Yet somehow, this moment in a small-town courthouse felt like one of the most difficult battles he had ever fought. "Stand up, Mr. Hudson," the judge commanded. "I want to get a better look at your little collection there." Fred rose slowly, his cane providing necessary support. The medals caught the fluorescent courtroom lights, creating small reflections that danced across the walls. "Impressive display," Albright continued sarcastically. "Tell me, which cereal box did the big one come from? That star-shaped trinket there, what's that supposed to represent?" Sarah couldn't remain silent any longer. "Your Honor, that's the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration." "The Medal of Honor?" Albright's laughter was cruel and sharp. "Do you take me for a fool, Counselor?" The Medal of Honor is reserved for genuine heroes, not for old men playing dress-up in surplus store costumes. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands frozen above the keys. Fred stood motionless, bearing the assault with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout his life. "Remove the jacket," Albright ordered suddenly. "I won't have this mockery continue in my courtroom. Take off that ridiculous costume immediately." "Your Honor," Sarah protested, her voice rising with desperation. "You cannot order a defendant to remove clothing in open court without proper cause. This is a violation of—" "I'll determine what's proper in my courtroom," Albright roared. "Mr. Hudson, remove that jacket now, or I'll hold you in contempt of court." Fred's hands moved slowly to the buttons of his jacket. Each button seemed to carry the weight of decades, of memories that belonged to a different world entirely. As he began to unfasten them, his mind drifted away from the courtroom, back to a jungle clearing where the sound of helicopters had meant salvation, where the weight of medals had been earned with blood and sacrifice. The first button came undone, then the second. In the gallery behind him, a few spectators shifted uncomfortably, sensing they were witnessing something fundamentally wrong. But Judge Albright seemed oblivious to the growing tension, his focus entirely on the humiliation of the old man standing before him. The third button slipped free from its threadbare hole, and suddenly Fred Hudson was no longer standing in a sterile courtroom. The fluorescent lights became tropical sunlight filtering through jungle canopy, and the judge's mocking voice transformed into the distant thunder of artillery. Vietnam, 1968. The battle for Hue had been raging for 3 weeks when Staff Sergeant Hudson's squad was pinned down by enemy machine gun fire. Private Tommy Martinez, barely 19 years old, lay bleeding in the open ground between their position and the enemy bunker. The kid was crying for his mother, his voice growing weaker with each passing minute. "Don't go out there, Sarge," Corporal Williams had whispered, his hands shaking as he reloaded his rifle. "It's suicide. They've got the whole area covered." But Fred had looked at that boy, someone's son, someone's pride and joy, and knew he couldn't leave him to die alone in the mud. The Medal of Honor around his neck wasn't just metal and ribbon. It was Tommy Martinez's life, saved at the cost of 3 bullet wounds and a permanently damaged knee that still ached on rainy days 47 years later. "Mr. Hudson," Judge Albright's sharp voice cut through the memory like a blade. "I'm waiting. Remove that ridiculous costume immediately." Sarah Jenkins watched the old man's face, noting the way his eyes had grown distant. She had seen that expression before. Her grandfather, also a veteran, had worn the same look when his memories transported him back to places he rarely spoke about. Her gaze fell to Fred's jacket, and for the first time she truly examined the decorations he wore. Most of the ribbons were familiar: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Infantryman Badge. But there, almost hidden among the others, was a small green beret insignia that made her breath catch. The crossed arrows of the Special Forces. Green berets. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were elite warriors, legends in their own right. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice carrying new conviction, "I request a brief recess to consult with my client." "Denied," Albright snapped. "Mr. Hudson, you have 10 seconds to comply, or I'll find you in contempt of court." 10, 9, 8. Fred's fingers hesitated on the 4th button. The jacket had been with him for decades, through countless ceremonies and memorials. It had been pressed and cleaned for his daughter's wedding, for his wife's funeral, for the funerals of too many friends. Each medal represented not just his own service, but the sacrifice of men who never made it home. 7, 6, 5. Sarah made a decision. She pulled out her cell phone and stepped toward the back of the courtroom, her fingers flying over the screen. She had noticed something else on Fred's jacket, a small unit patch that might be his salvation. 4, 3. The number she dialed was one she had memorized years ago when her brother served in Afghanistan. The Special Forces headquarters at Fort Bragg. If Fred Hudson was truly one of their own, they would want to know what was happening in this courtroom. 2, 1. "Special Forces Command, this is Sergeant Miller," a crisp voice answered. "This is Sarah Jenkins, attorney in North Carolina," she whispered urgently. "I have an elderly veteran being humiliated in court right now. He's wearing Special Forces insignia, and I think he might be someone important. Ma'am, we get a lot of calls about— His name is Frederick William Hudson, Sarah interrupted. 84 years old, Medal of Honor recipient. The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats. When Sergeant Miller spoke again, his entire tone had changed. Ma'am, did you say Fred Hudson? Sergeant Major Hudson, 3rd Special Forces Group? I don't know his rank or unit. He's in Judge Albright's courtroom right now, and the judge is forcing him to remove his uniform jacket, calling his medals fake. Jesus Christ, Miller breathed. Ma'am, don't let that man leave. Do you understand me? Don't let him go anywhere. We're mobilizing right now. The line went dead, and Sarah stared at her phone in amazement. In the span of 30 seconds, the entire atmosphere had shifted. Whoever Fred Hudson really was, his name carried weight in places that mattered. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Albright had risen from his chair, his face red with anger. Mr. Hudson, you are now in contempt of court. I'm imposing a fine of $500 and ordering you to undergo a psychological evaluation. Clearly, you're living in some fantasy where you believe yourself to be a decorated war hero. Fred finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. Your Honor, I've never claimed to be anything more than what I am. I served my country for 30 years. These medals were earned honestly, and they represent the memory of better men than myself who didn't come home. 30 years? Albright laughed. Old man, you probably couldn't serve 30 days without washing out. Guards, escort this delusional defendant from my courtroom. But Sarah was already moving back toward the front, her phone buzzing with an incoming call from an unknown number. She answered quickly. Miss Jenkins? This is General Marcus Thorne, Special Operations Command. We understand you have Sergeant Major Hudson in your custody? Sarah's knees nearly buckled. A general was calling her directly. Yes, sir. The judge is holding him in contempt and ordering psychological evaluation. Ma'am, that man is a living legend. He's saved more lives than you can imagine, and he's earned every decoration he wears. We're en route to your location now. Estimated arrival in 45 minutes. Through the courtroom windows, Sarah could see the first news van pulling into the parking lot. Somehow, word was already spreading. The story of an elderly veteran being humiliated by a small-town judge was exactly the kind of narrative that captured public attention. Judge Albright seemed oblivious to the gathering storm. He was too focused on his victim, too intoxicated by his own power to notice that the world was about to change around him. 27 minutes after Sarah's initial call, the phone rang in General Marcus Thorne's Pentagon office. The 53-year-old career officer was reviewing deployment schedules when his aide knocked urgently. Sir, we have a situation developing in North Carolina. It involves Sergeant Major Hudson. General Thorne's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. In 30 years of military service, he had encountered only a handful of men who commanded instant respect across all branches of the armed forces. Fred Hudson was one of them. What kind of situation? A civilian judge is apparently holding him in contempt of court, sir. Called his decorations fake and ordered him to remove his uniform jacket. The judge is also demanding psychological evaluation. The coffee cup hit the desk with enough force to crack the ceramic. General Thorne had personally pinned medals on Fred Hudson's chest, had stood beside him at ceremonies honoring fallen soldiers, had witnessed firsthand the quiet dignity with which the old sergeant major carried himself. Get me a secure line to Fort Bragg immediately, Thorne barked. I want every available officer from Hudson's old unit mobilized. And contact the Media Relations Department. If this story breaks nationally before we can control it, heads are going to roll. Within minutes, the Hudson Protocol was in full effect. It wasn't an official military procedure, but rather an unspoken understanding among the Special Forces community. When one of their legends was threatened, they responded with overwhelming force. Back in the courtroom, Judge Albright was savoring his moment of absolute authority. He had ordered the bailiffs to handcuff Fred, though the elderly veteran offered no resistance. The sight of an 84-year-old war hero in shackles should have troubled anyone with a functioning conscience, but Albright seemed energized by the display. Let this be a lesson, he announced to the small crowd of spectators. No one is above the law in my courtroom, regardless of whatever fantasies they may harbor about their past. Sarah checked her phone again. General Thorne had texted updates every few minutes. Airborne in 10 minutes. Then, ETA 35 minutes. And finally, heads will roll for this. She looked at Fred, who sat quietly in the defendant's chair, his hands still cuffed behind his back. Despite everything, his expression remained serene, almost meditative. She wondered what memories sustained him through this humiliation. Fred was thinking about a different kind of courtroom, a military tribunal in Saigon, where he had testified about a massacre prevented, about soldiers saved from their own worst impulses. He had spoken truth to power then, just as he remained truthful now. The medals weren't about glory. They were about responsibility, about the weight of decisions made when lives hung in the balance. Your Honor, Sarah tried one more time, I strongly urge you to reconsider this course of action. My client is a decorated veteran, and this treatment? Your client is a fraud, Albright interrupted. And apparently, so are you, counselor. Anyone who would enable this charade is complicit in his deception. Outside, the news vans had multiplied. Local reporters had arrived first, but now Sarah could see the distinctive logos of national networks. The story was spreading across social media platforms faster than anyone could have anticipated. Judge humiliates Medal of Honor, recipient over traffic ticket. The hashtag Justice for Fred was already trending. Judge Albright remained blissfully unaware of the media circus gathering outside his courthouse. He was focused entirely on completing Fred's humiliation, perhaps even considering additional charges. In his mind, he was teaching an important lesson about respect for authority and the consequences of fraudulent behavior. He had no idea that at that very moment, a two-star general was personally leading a convoy of military vehicles racing toward his courthouse. He couldn't have imagined that the Secretary of Defense had been briefed on the situation, or that the President himself would soon be asking pointed questions about how a Medal of Honor recipient had been treated by the civilian court system. Fred Hudson sat quietly in his shackles, drawing strength from memories of men who had faced far worse with equal dignity. He thought about Tommy Martinez, pulled from certain death under enemy fire. He remembered Captain Johnson, carried 3 miles through hostile jungle after taking shrapnel to the chest. He recalled dozens of faces, young men who had depended on his strength when their own failed them. The medals weren't trophies. They were promises kept, obligations fulfilled, trust honored, and no small-town judge with an oversized ego could diminish their meaning. 23 minutes until the general's arrival. The storm was about to break. The courthouse parking lot had transformed into something resembling a military staging area. 3 black SUVs flanked by motorcycle escorts pulled up in perfect formation, followed by a convoy of olive green vehicles bearing the distinctive markings of the United States Army Special Forces Command. General Marcus Thorne emerged from the lead vehicle wearing his full-dress uniform, every ribbon and decoration precisely positioned. His weathered face, marked by 30-plus years of command decisions and combat deployments, showed an expression of barely controlled fury. Behind him, 6 officers of various ranks moved with the practiced precision of men accustomed to high-stakes operations. The media crowd had swelled to nearly 50 reporters and camera operators. Live broadcasts were already beaming images of the military response across the nation, with breathless commentators speculating about the significance of such an unprecedented show of force for a simple traffic court case. Inside the courtroom, Judge Albright was dictating his final judgment when the doors burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. General Thorne strode down the center aisle, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the shackled figure of Fred Hudson. The other officers flanked him on both sides, their synchronized footsteps echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom. Albright's mouth fell open as he took in the sight of more military brass than he had ever seen in one place. The lead figure, a man whose very presence commanded instant attention, approached the bench with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Albright sputtered, trying to regain control of his courtroom. "This is a civilian court of law, not some military." His words died as General Thorne came to attention directly in front of Fred Hudson's chair. With movements refined by decades of ceremony and tradition, the general rendered a perfect military salute, crisp, precise, and held with unwavering respect. Fred Hudson, despite his age and the restraints binding his hands, straightened in his chair. His body remembered the protocol even when his circumstances made a proper response impossible. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the honor being paid to him. Sergeant Major Frederick William Hudson, General Thorne announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. 3rd Special Forces Group, Airborne. 30 years of distinguished service to the United States of America. The general reached into his jacket and withdrew a folder thick with official documents. Your Honor, he continued, his tone making the title sound like an accusation. Allow me to enlighten you about the man you have seen fit to humiliate in your courtroom today. Judge Albright tried to interrupt, but General Thorne's commanding presence silenced him with a single glance. Sergeant Major Hudson enlisted in the United States Army in 1961 at the age of 18. He volunteered for airborne training, then Special Forces selection, one of the most rigorous military programs in existence. He served 3 combat tours in Vietnam, where he earned the Bronze Star with V device for Valor, the Silver Star for gallantry in action, and 2 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat. The general's voice grew stronger with each decoration mentioned. He earned the Combat Infantryman Badge, the Parachutist Badge, and the Special Forces tab. He served as a team leader, senior non-commissioned officer, and ultimately as Sergeant Major of his unit. Sarah watched Judge Albright's face grow progressively paler as the litany of Fred's actual service record unfolded. Each medal the judge had mocked represented genuine heroism, documented sacrifice, proven valor. On March 15, 1968, General Thorne continued, during the Battle of Hue, Sergeant Hudson single-handedly assaulted an enemy machine gun position that had pinned down his squad. Despite being wounded twice, he eliminated the enemy position and rescued Private First Class Thomas Martinez from certain death under intense enemy fire. The general paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the courtroom. For this action, Sergeant Major Hudson was awarded the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration. It was presented to him personally by President Johnson in a White House ceremony, attended by members of Congress and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Fred Hudson had closed his eyes, transported once again to that muddy battlefield where a young soldier's life had hung in the balance. The ceremony at the White House seemed like something from another lifetime, a formal recognition of what had simply been the right thing to do. After Vietnam, General Thorne continued relentlessly, Sergeant Major Hudson continued his service. He trained new Special Forces soldiers, led peacekeeping missions, and served as a mentor to countless young warriors. He retired with full honors in 1991 after exactly 30 years of service. The general stepped closer to Judge Albright's bench, his presence now intimidating rather than merely impressive. Since his retirement, Sergeant Major Hudson has volunteered countless hours at veterans' hospitals, has spoken at military academies, and has attended the funerals of over 200 fallen soldiers, men he trained, served with, or simply honored through his presence. Judge Albright attempted to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't bother to find out, General Thorne replied coldly. You saw an elderly man with traffic violations and decided to exercise your petty authority rather than show basic human respect. The general turned to address the packed courtroom, his voice carrying the full weight of military authority. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the presence of a living legend. Sergeant Major Frederick Hudson represents the very best of American military service. His decorations weren't purchased at a surplus store. They were earned through blood, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to his fellow soldiers and his country. He gestured toward Fred, who still sat quietly in his shackles. This man has saved lives, has faced death repeatedly in service of others, and has dedicated his entire adult life to the defense of the freedoms we all enjoy. He is a national treasure, and he has been treated today with unconscionable disrespect. General Thorne's voice rose to a command volume that made everyone in the courtroom sit straighter. I am placing Sergeant Major Hudson under military protection, effective immediately. Any further harassment or inappropriate treatment will be considered a matter of national security and will be dealt with accordingly. The transformation in the courtroom was complete. Where minutes before there had been the routine mundanity of traffic court, there was now the electric tension of a confrontation between military honor and civilian arrogance. Judge Albright looked around desperately, as if seeking some escape from the situation he had created. The media attention, The military response, the obvious righteousness of the decorated veteran he had mocked, all of it combined to create a perfect storm of public relations disaster. "General," he began weakly, "I think there may have been some misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," General Thorne replied icily, "was your assumption that you could humiliate a genuine American hero without consequences." The aftermath moved with the inexorable force of an avalanche. Within 6 hours of General Thorne's courthouse intervention, the story had become the lead item on every major news network. The footage of an elderly Medal of Honor recipient sitting in handcuffs while a judge mocked his decorations sparked immediate nationwide outrage. Judge Harold Albright returned to his chambers to find 17 missed calls from the State Judicial Review Board, 12 from various news organizations, and 1 from the governor's office. The social media response was swift and merciless. # Justice for Fred had been joined by # Albright Must Go and # Respect Our Veterans. By evening, Chief Judge Margaret Williamson delivered an ultimatum: resign immediately or face formal impeachment proceedings. Judge Albright's 20-year career ended with a brief resignation letter. 3 weeks later, the state legislature passed the Hudson Act, requiring all judges and court officials to complete sensitivity training regarding veteran affairs. The law mandated that military decorations worn in court be treated with appropriate respect. Fred Hudson declined all interview requests, preferring instead to sit on his front porch with his old dog, drinking coffee and watching the news vans gradually depart from his neighborhood. 6 months later, Fred was working in his garage when Harold Albright appeared at his driveway. The former judge looked older, tired, wearing simple khakis instead of expensive suits. "Mr. Hudson," Albright began quietly, "I know I have no right to come here, but I needed to speak with you. I've spent these months learning about your service, reading about Vietnam, about what you endured. I realized I had attacked not just you, but everything you represent." His voice cracked. "I lost my position, my reputation, my career. But more importantly, I lost the ability to look in the mirror without seeing someone who had behaved despicably toward a genuine hero." Fred wiped his hands on a rag and gestured toward 2 folding chairs. "Sit down," he said simply. After several minutes of silence, Albright continued. "I can't undo what I did. But I needed you to know that I understand now what I failed to see then." Fred looked at this broken man and saw not an enemy, but a fellow human being seeking redemption. "Harold," he said quietly, "we all make mistakes. The measure of a man isn't whether he stumbles, but whether he learns from it." "How can you be so generous?" Albright asked, tears in his eyes. Fred smiled slightly. "I've seen real evil in this world. You weren't evil. You were ignorant and arrogant. But you came here today, which tells me something about your character." He retrieved 2 bottles of beer from his garage refrigerator. "The worst thing that can happen to a man isn't being shot at or wounded. It's losing the ability to show mercy when mercy is called for." They talked until sunset, 2 unlikely companions sharing stories about service, failure, and redemption. When Albright finally left, he did so as a different man. Not redeemed, perhaps, but pointed toward a better version of himself. Fred Hudson returned to his simple life, secure in the knowledge that real honor isn't displayed on a uniform jacket, but lived out in daily choices. The medals were symbols, but the true measure of his service was written in the lives he had saved and the mercy he had shown to a man who had tried to diminish him. In the end, that mercy proved more powerful than any decoration ever could.